First, what I'd like to do today is actually share with you a little bit about our vision, about how we believe our science is going to fundamentally change the way that soldiers and technology interact in 2050. And as I try to persuade you of this vision, what I hope that you see is that our vision is not the only way, but one way in which we can ensure cognitive dominance for our future soldiers. I expect that you'll give me a hard time about that, but I'm going to try to persuade you anyways. So the first, what's our problem space? So as we've already talked about today, right, there's pervasive technology. Everywhere we look, both in civilian life and in military life, we have lots of technology on the field. And one of the things that we often talk about is that the long-standing burden for soldiers has been the physical burden, which we've talked about today, but it may soon be outpaced by a cognitive burden of all this information, all this technology that still has to be processed. So one of the things that we're trying to do is find some ways that we can change the way that technology can actually adapt to the soldier, rather than always needing the soldier to adapt to the technology. As I say that, I'm very cognizant, it keeps me up at night actually, the fact that those folks are our future soldiers. They use technology fundamentally in a different way than even I understand now, right? So I think one of our challenges that I'm not going to address today, but is just what are the things that we also need to change in our model of technology in the future based on how folks are changing their use today as they develop. But that said, so what are some of the current human technology challenges that we have? I always, invariably, have to talk about my favorite way in which we have some challenge integrating humans and technology, and that's whenever we try to use technology to help us with our language. So as you can see this transcription of a voicemail from my colleague, it's not clear to me why he's sure that the power supply to the tech systems that I need badly, right? He's going to come to 4600. He's going to do that, whatever that means. And he doesn't know where I'm doing. I'm just hoping I could be fine. Later, bye. So should I call someone about that? No, right? So my point is just that as we start working with technology, right, we have these weaknesses and strengths of the technology that we want to start to overcome. Now this is what I'm going to call a trite example, but the interactions of humans and technology can have very serious consequences. I'm not a pilot. Many of you are pilots, so allow me to butcher your technical expertise as I explain pilot-induced oscillations. So here, the fundamental challenge that I'm trying to bring up here is that it's this mismatch between a human perceptual system of trying to descend without blowing up the plane, that there's a human perceptual system about how fast the plane is ascending that's in contrast with the amount of time it takes for the gauges to give updated information about the way in which the plane is going to land. You're with me, right? Just nod. So the idea here is that we're trying to find this optimal integration between human perceptual expertise and the system, the technology, and when that information can arrive to humans so that we can better integrate them to leverage the strengths of the human and the strengths of the technology to help mitigate each other's weaknesses. And that's the fundamental theoretical approach that we take in our research. So why does that matter? So whenever we have futuristic predictions of future ops, we always have an explosion in the amount of manned and unmanned teaming. So the amount of human autonomy integration that we're going to have to deal with and leverage and interact with our strengths and weaknesses will only increase. And in addition, these futuristic predictions always have this human that's outfitted with this headgear that's giving the information that they need, right? But the question is, if that's what the technology that we envision, how are we really going to deliver the right information to the soldier at the right time? It's a great future capability for my strategic army folks to give to us as S&T community, but we have to realize it somehow. So one of the ways that we realize it, thank you General Palmer for setting this up, is we actually believe that we can measure brain networks to quantify something about soldiers and predict soldier performance. So these are two brains. As you may know, the brain has different brain regions that we've studied as neuroscientists for the past 100 years. These brain regions, as you can see in these two different brains, are similar in location, but their shape has changed. The location is a little bit different. But in general, whenever we start thinking, I'm going to talk about brain networks today. To think about a brain network, you have to first understand that the brain contains regions. Okay. And that said, we can then look at two types of networks. We're going to talk about functional brain networks, and we're going to talk about structural brain networks today. In functional brain networks, so what you're looking at here is maybe of two different individuals. You're looking at a top-down view of the brain, And the circles are representing brain regions, and the lines are representing communication or electrical activity that's flowing among brain regions. These two brains, these two individuals, were doing a target detection task. So they were looking for a target of interest. Whenever they detect a target of interest, you'll see that the brain regions, the balls are increasing in size, and then information is spreading out from the regions. Are you with me? So I can't measure your brain signals, but I can look at your head. So this is a human-human coupling. You can give me feedback by just moving your bodies. Okay. So functional brain networks, when I talk about them, so this data is literally just recorded electrical activity from the scalp. These are electrodes on the brain. And we can start looking at brain activity that's related to detecting targets. We can also put folks into an MRI scanner, and we can look at the structural connections between brain regions. So these are the axons of neurons that allow this electrical information to transfer from one brain region to another. And so with the fusion-weighted imaging, what we can do is we can look at the differences. These are two different individuals, and you can look at two regions that are the same in the brains, but they have different structural connections between them. Are you with me? Okay. This is the most important part of my talk. You're going to have your finger. The brain on the left is 1. The brain on the right is 2. I don't want any social influence on this decision-making you're about to do. So you're going to take your hand, you're going to put it underneath your other hand. Humor me. Thank you. Love you. Using your own expertise about life, which structural connection is better? The structural connections in the brain on the left, number 1, or the structural connections on the brain on the right, number 2? So just put whatever your answer is underneath. No one changed their vote. Who thinks it's number 2? That's me. Good job. Okay. Told you it was the most important question of the thing. I ask everybody. Deputy SecDev, pick me. All right, anyways, moving on. So today in the talk, so I told you that we're going to talk about brains, right? Functional brains, structural brains. Today we're going to ask 2 questions about whether we can use brain networks to quantify soldiers and what I argue to create cognitive dominance. Question number 1. Do structural brain networks capture learning? Question number 2. Do functional brain networks reflect our social networks? If you don't like my question, Jay, you'll like eventually. First question, structural brain networks. So one of the things, some of the results that we have in the lab, we've developed a new method that looks at structural connections in the brain. That we call the local structural, who cares? So if you look at those pictures, here's the most important thing I want you to know as a consumer of brain information. Whenever a scientist shows up and tries to convince you to give them money, and they say that they've used structural brain networks, in the brain there are lots of fiber tracks, these wires, they cross, right? They're called crossing fibers. The most prevalent structural imaging method in the field cannot detect crossing fibers. 73% of the brain, so I'm going to estimate 67 to 83% of the brain, has crossing fibers. So don't believe anybody who's going to tell you that they can predict something from structure if they can't detect crossing fibers. It's just this pet peeve I have, so thank you for listening. So our method detects crossing fibers, and you can see that in the bottom row. Yeah? See how the 2 cross? Are you with me? Thank you. Thank you. He's like, please go on. Whenever we use the local structure and can fingerprint, we're going to create these things called fingerprints, which is basically 433,000 estimates of structural integrity. Who cares what it means? What's cool about it is that whenever we look at that structural fingerprint between people, we can see individual differences. So with your naked eye, you can see the difference between the blue, which is the structural fingerprint from one person, and the red, with a structural fingerprint from the other person. What we can then ask is how reliable are these structural images, and so we can then have these same individuals come back to the lab, in this case 6 months later, but we've looked at 6 weeks up to a year. And what you should be able to even see with your naked eye is the fact that the structural connectome is largely robust. It's reliable over time. So we can ask the question, if we look at 200 plus individuals, can we actually use these fingerprints to identify individuals? So does it capture things about our individual identity? So the way that we'll do this is we're going to take a fingerprint, say like the blue one from the initial scan, and we're going to say, is that fingerprint more similar to a fingerprint from that same individual later than it is, or is it also just as similar to a fingerprint from another individual? So in this plot, what we're showing you is the similarity of the fingerprint from the same person creates a distribution of similarity that's distinct, it does not overlap, the distribution of similarity from fingerprints from different people. What does this mean? This means that our structural fingerprint is a sensitive measure, and we can capture things about identity. The exciting part from the Army's perspective, right, is not necessarily whether I can do something about identity, but I can tell something about your learning, your expertise. We used, so we then can ask the question of what's the genetic versus, like the nature-nurture question, what's the role of genetics versus experience? And we're going to do that by looking at varying levels of genetic similarity from identical twins, fraternal twins, siblings, and unrelated. And what you can see here is when I actually plot the similarity, what you would have expected if genetics played a large role was that the identical twins would have a distribution that does not overlap with the unrelated individuals. But instead what we see is that these distributions overlap. What does that mean? It means that largely our structural wiring in our brain, despite what I thought before when I went into this, is actually largely driven by experience, not genetics. So this is a good thing for us as an Army because that means this could potentially be a metric we can use to capture the effects of training. But at what time scale can we look at these training effects or experience effects? So in this first study that I'm going to tell you about, we looked at long-term learning from baseball expertise. So we recruited Columbia baseball players because they'd won 3 consecutive years in a row, so they apparently were good. And we compared it to age-matched controls. We brought them into the lab. They did a functional task where they were trying to do a pitch discrimination. So we showed them different types of baseball pitches. They had to discriminate what the pitch was. We found the expected differences where experts were substantially better and faster at the task than non-experts. And we could then look at their brains. First, we did across participants, and we said, looking at the structural brain, can we see modules, these different structural modules? What's a structural module? What that means is if you think about, let me give you an analogy from, let's say if I took your phone, right, and I looked at everybody you recently texted or sent an email to, right? I can start understanding who you're most structurally connected to, who you communicate with a lot, based on the frequency at which you communicate that information, right? You have a lot more communication with folks that you know versus ones that you don't know. A module is essentially reflecting things where there's a tight amount of structural connections, an easy way of sharing information across those brain regions compared to others. So what we can find across these participants were these generally 5 structural subnetworks were merged, and we can ask, was there any difference of expertise across the communication among these modules? And the answer was yes. So experts we showed had stronger connectivity between 2 of the modules, module 1 and module 5. All that's to mean is just that there was a quantitative effect that we could see of expertise. And what was really cool is that if we then plotted the functional difference, so these are brain regions that showed functional differences in activity for experts compared to novices on the task, we can see a nice proof of principle, which is that our functional differences, our functional network differences overlap with our structural differences, which is great, because we think that's the way that the brain works, right? So that's over long-term training. So those folks have been playing baseball for at least a decade, if not longer. What about more short-term learning? Because we would love to be able to do something like 6 weeks of training and see structural influences in the brain. So in this case, we recruited participants to come in. They learned a new visual motor task. It was like playing the piano. And we scanned their brain every 2 weeks. So we could then ask, can we actually see any difference in the structural connections for the rate at which folks learned this task? So the first thing to ask that question, we had to demonstrate within the data that we had participants who either learned faster or slower, and you can see by these curves that we did have faster learners and slower learners if you compare the green line to the red line. Once we have differences in the rate at which people learn the task, we can then ask, okay, well, is any of that learning rate dictated from the structure? And the answer is yes. Some of the structural connections within the visual cortex showed a strong relationship between the rate at which they learned the task. So why is this relevant? Again, it allows us to start having metrics where we can start quantifying the effects of training. Once we're able to detect the fact that someone is learning a task well or is learning the task at a different rate, we can then do science to say, how can we do an intervention where we can improve that time scale or what process we use for someone to learn that task? Are you with me? Thank you, meeting faces. Second question, oh, sorry. So what are the bigger pictures from those results? So that's very much in the weeds. Why did we as our Army or as Allied Forces care? Well, the question, as I was just saying, is if we can detect these differences in learning, can we do this in military tasks? So right now, one of the biggest challenges I think we have is that the bulk of our neuroscience research uses single individuals in a white-walled room with a given computer screen doing a single task at a time. So can we truly extrapolate how the brain is functioning in that task to what a brain actually has to do when we're doing concurrent tasking in a very realistic environment. So what are the sorts of military tasks? And this is I'm constantly going around trying to find some military group who really wants to invest some time and interest in picking what are the tasks that we should go after, what ones will give us the biggest bang for our buck if we could get structural metrics or functional metrics in the brain that could predict differences in learning. So if we can detect those differences in learning, then how can we adapt the training to make it better for different individuals? So how can we individualize the training for quote unquote for free? And then this is my ethical question as a pitch to one of the panels of, will misuse occur will misuse of this occur? Meaning that are we going to start using these differences to exclude rather than to adapt? Sad for you, 30 seconds is not time to go through my second question, which is whether functional brain networks reflect our social networks. So I can fly through real quick. So brains have, whenever we're doing social processing, we have this brain networks that show functional activity. We can then say, oh, look, some people have different amounts of activity within this network whenever they're doing a social task. So some people have more activity than others. Interestingly, we can correlate that and show that based on how their social structural networks are, so this is derived from Facebook data, the sparse friend network is indicating that this person's friends on Facebook, for example, he might have church friends are different from work friends that are different from recreational friends. Those folks don't interact. And if folks who have this sparse friend network actually show more activity within this network. So these are, again, different characteristics of individuals that tell us that their brain works differently, but do we care? And the answer, I think, is yes, because we can show this in a different analysis that folks who have higher activity within this functional network are actually differentially susceptible to peer influence. So we had teenagers come back, they do a simulated driving task with a passenger in the car. Whenever they have a risk-taking passenger, someone who's encouraging them to take more risks, or if they have a risk-adverse passenger, someone who's encouraging them to be less risk-adverse, folks who have higher activity within this network, a week earlier in the laboratory, we can predict that they're going to either accept that peer influence or not in a real-world situation. So the activation within this network, I think, matters and can tell us something about how social influence will influence our performance. And that concludes my second question.